As we all know, the U.S. Supreme Court has recently heard arguments both for and against President Obama's healthcare reform initiative, known as the Affordable Care Act. One of the key provisions at the center of the court case is what's known as the individual mandate. So could you talk to us a little bit about, what are your views on the individual mandate in its current form? Would you say you're for it or against it?
I think the individual mandate was as good a solution politically to getting the law passed as they could have come up with. If it was possible to start with a clean sheet of paper, I wouldn't have used the individual mandate. But the individual mandate, and I know you've talked to Professor Pauly about this, was a Republican idea. And as part of President Obama's and the proponents of the law's compromise, they reached across the aisle, took a Republican idea, came from the Heritage Foundation initially, was endorsed early on by Newt Gingrich, was adopted in Massachusetts in Romney Care. I think they thought that was a big step towards the compromise that had to be necessary to get a universal health care law passed. So given the political realities, I think the mandate was a decently good way to go about it. It turns out now that doing it that way exposes the law to some very significant constitutional challenge, which it seems everybody underestimated while the law was being considered, when it was first being passed, after it was first passed. I don't think anybody felt that the legal challenges were going to be taken as seriously as they are. But the mandate may bring the whole law down, may very well bring the whole law down. Like I said, if I started from a clean sheet of paper, I would do it differently. I would do it as a tax, which probably makes it clearly constitutional beyond challenge, and a voucher system. Everybody in the country would have to have money deducted from their paycheck, just like they do for Social Security, just like they do for Medicare. And in return for that, you get a voucher that would enable you to go out and buy health care. Maybe you could buy it from a governmental entity like Medicare, but I think this being America, you'd be able to buy it from private vendors. And if it was structured that way, I don't think there'd been any constitutional infirmity to it.
Now, this is a very complicated multi-part law overall. So can you talk to me a little bit about, overall, what are your views on the different provisions of the Affordable Care Act?
Our healthcare system in this country is so complex and is so distorted in the way it's set up that it requires reform from top to bottom. More people who go into medicine go into high-priced surgical subspecialties and other subspecialties than primary care. That needs to be changed. The health insurance provisions where people with pre-existing conditions aren't allowed to buy insurance, or where your rates go up astronomically if you use health care. These are very bad things. So it requires A to Z reform. And the law got to be 2,700 pages in bill form. They keep talking about the law being over 2,000 pages. The law, I think, actually only comes out to 975 pages. Oh. But the bill was 2,700 pages. And if you look at that bill, there's only a few paragraphs that deal with the mandate. Notwithstanding that, the mandate is the centerpiece of legislation. And there are many other things, particularly all of the health insurance reforms, that are, one could well argue, inextricably intertwined with it. On the insurance industry side, what the health insurers gave up was the right to exclude people who looked like they'd need too much health care, or the right to kick people out of their policies if they used too much health care. The insurance companies accepted community ratings so that they couldn't charge you an exorbitant premium if you needed more health care. Those are all difficult pills for the insurance industry to swallow. And what they insisted on in return was an individual mandate, or some kind of mandate, so that everybody would get into the game. Otherwise, they said they'd be eaten alive by adverse selection. People who considered themselves healthy would stay out until they needed health care, and then they would come in and they would be able to insist, because of the provisions of the law, that they be insured at that point. It would be like a homeowner running into a homeowner's insurance company saying, "Sign me up quick, my house is on fire." And so the mandate was put in as the quid pro quo, the negotiated deal to get those other patient protections.
So, I mean, if the court strikes down the individual mandate or even the whole Affordable Care Act, I mean, what does this mean for healthcare going forward?
Well, before I answer that question, let me deal with the first part of what you said. If the court strikes down the mandate, which I sat in on the arguments, I listened to the judge's questions, and I've read a lot of analyses since then, I think there's a pretty good chance they'll strike down the mandate. The other question then that becomes very important is, will they strike down the whole law? There is a long-standing constitutional principle in favor of constitutionality, presumption of constitutionality. The court has to show allegiance to the Constitution. So if Congress puts something in a law that's unconstitutional, the court has no choice but to take that out. But everything else in the law that's constitutional, they should leave in as a part of the separation of powers, the respect of democratic majority. I don't mean Democrat versus Republican. I mean representative democracy. So there's so much else in the law that they could keep in place. But they would have to be able to decide what stays and what goes. And in the 1.5 hours of oral argument over severability, the justices made it clear that they didn't have much of a clue where to begin in deciding what stays and what goes. Justice Scalia, and this is a little bit of a mischaracterization, but other justices, I guess it was Justice Kagan, quipped that it would be too difficult for Justice Scalia's law clerks to have to go through the whole 2,700 pages of the bill and figure out what stays and what goes. They'd probably throw it all out. Well, if the court is supposed to keep as much of the law as it can, and they throw it all out, that would throw it back to Congress to say, if you want all these other provisions, let me tell you what some of the other provisions are. Things that have nothing to do with the mandate, like nutritional labeling. You go into a McDonald's, it tells you how much a Big Mac has by way of calories. Other things, loan forgiveness for people's medical school loans if they go into primary care or go to work in an underserved area, has nothing to do with the individual mandate. Funding for black lung disease, for research into cancer and things of that nature. Those things don't have to go just because the mandate goes. But for the Supreme Court to sit down there and try to figure out provision by provision with hundreds of provisions, what is tied and what isn't tied, what Congress would have intended to have if it didn't have the mandate, that's pretty much a legislative function. And so the court can say, we don't want to wade too far into the Congress's legislative function, which is respecting Congress more. To say, we're going to leave as much of your work intact, we're going to take it all out. Or on the other side, saying, we, the court, are going to try to decide what you wanted to leave in and what you wanted to take out. Both of them are an encroachment upon congressional legislative domain, and which is the greater? One of the justices asked that question.
Now, but do you feel like, I mean, without the individual mandate, I mean, what would have to happen, if that is thrown out, I mean, what would have to happen in order to sort of keep some of the intents of the law intact? I mean, do you think the majority of it can move forward, or are there certain things that the administration or Congress would have to go back and do? And if so, what would they have to do? Or what would you advise they do?
Let's imagine an alternative universe where the Congress is bipartisan or nonpartisan and functional, and the court took out an important piece of their legislation, and there were many other pieces that were unconnected. The day after the court did that, Congress could meet in session and say, let's put back these 200 provisions or 300 provisions and so forth. The concept that our Congress at this point in time, given how fractious and divided they are, would do that is ridiculous. So at one point in the argument in the Supreme Court, one of the attorneys for the government was talking about the court's job being to ascertain the will of Congress. What would Congress want us to do in terms of keeping the rest of the law intact? And Justice Kennedy, who's really going to be the decider here because you've got the 4 liberal justices and the 4 conservative justices, and Kennedy's a swing justice. I predict what happens with the mandate, by the way, will happen with a 5-4 vote. Very dangerous to make a prediction. I shouldn't do it, but do it. Anyway, what Kennedy said was, is that the real Congress or a hypothetical Congress? Because a hypothetical Congress, the day after the court struck down the whole law, would meet and they'd put back in all the parts that weren't controversial. But every part's controversial now because politics makes everything controversial. That's a very, very long-winded way of saying I can't answer your question.
No, that's actually very helpful. I mean, given that environment, and I think most people would agree that you were correct in characterizing that environment, I mean, what would you say is sort of one thing that should be done to help tackle all of the problems with the American healthcare system? I mean, is there one, I mean, I know there's probably a lot of things, but can you think of one thing that if in that hypothetical Congress, or if there was a hypothetically could get done right away that would make a big help, what would you say it would be?
Replace all the congressmen, congresspeople? Excuse me. I don't know. I don't think it's likely to happen at this point in time. I'm not sure it'll happen in my lifetime. But one of the things that could happen is that the American public, realizing the need for universal health care and realizing that we've gone down a dysfunctional road in relying to the extent that we have on for-profit health care, will say, okay, let's just wipe it all out, start with a clean sheet of paper, and come up with something like governmental health care, like France has, or like Italy has, or like Britain has. The thing is that none of those countries are just sailing along happily now. With aging populations, advancing technology, sagging economies, all of the countries that have universal health care in Europe and elsewhere are struggling to maintain that national commitment. I think it's a shame, an embarrassment that our country is the only major nation on the face of the planet that hasn't made a national commitment to universal health care. And there are a lot of reasons why we haven't. I don't think it's because Americans are inherently selfish or greedy or whatever, but we've kind of let the system evolve piece by piece by piece over generations, and we've essentially painted ourselves into a corner. And when you ask me, what should we have? I'm not sure how we can get from where we are to where we need to be. When this law was being debated in Congress, you may remember, a lot of people who were against the law made a big point out of the fact that it was over 2,000 pages. And why should it be that long? Why should it be so long that most of the Congress people say we haven't read it? Our staffs have read it piecemeal. The thing is that we've got a very complex system, or non-system, some would say, and almost every piece of it has to be changed in some way. You can't do that with a 50-page law or a 100-page law. And whether we can get there from where we are now, it's anybody's guess.